book, isn't it? Good morning.
Good morning.
We're going to get started. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 3 this morning. We are officially in our new quarter, and we are, along with all the other classes, are in the book of Genesis together, considering the first few chapters of Genesis for a little while. And if you'd like to see where all we're going to go this quarter, there's a schedule in the foyer, and if we run out, just let me know. I'll print more. But last I looked, there were still some schedules in the foyer that'll show us everywhere we're going to go this summer on Sunday mornings. But this last Sunday morning, we looked at Genesis chapter 2, and today we're going to be in Genesis chapter 3. If you'd like to open up to Genesis chapter 3. And because we have done so much in Genesis recently, I've been preaching through Genesis, and this morning we did Genesis chapter 16, and over the past year we started with chapter 1 and have gone through that, and we've looked at Genesis from a couple different angles. When I saw that we were doing Genesis again, I said, how are we going to do this a little bit different this time? So we're looking at Genesis this time, and not all of it, just the first few chapters, a little bit more apologetically, and we're considering it from the perspective of, sometimes people struggle with understanding the book of Genesis, and sometimes people seem to find maybe holes or something in the book of Genesis, and so we're considering what can we learn about our world, and what can we learn about the veracity or the truth of the Bible from the book of Genesis, these first few chapters. And so we've hopped around a little bit, and last week I really enjoyed the discussions that we had. And I'm looking forward to looking at Genesis chapter 3 today, because it is a very important chapter. It's the first real conflict in the Bible, and it's the conflict that sets up everything that follows and sets up the situation that we find ourselves in today concerning sin and sickness and all of those things. And so it's important to make sure that we're putting Genesis 3 in its historical context of what did the people who Moses wrote to think when they read Genesis 3, and in its literary context, what kind of literature is it, as well as just its context here in the book of Genesis itself, following chapter 2 and coming before chapter 4, which is incidentally where 3 always lands right between 2 and 4. At least in my experience, that's the case. And so we're going to look a little bit at a few things this morning from Genesis chapter 3. But before we get started, is there anything in particular, and this is a question I think I'm going to ask every week, and so you can look ahead at the schedule and then think about these questions if you want to. Is there anything in particular from Genesis 3 that you have heard or wondered about or wanted to know or just heard that people struggle with from chapter 3 that you would like to consider this morning? And we can maybe start there if there is anything from Genesis chapter 3 that is of interest or a question to you.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Do we have any way to know how much time passed from 2 to 3?
Okay, all right. That's the question of the, that is the question. So I'm glad you asked that question. We did ask that question, I think 2 weeks ago Johnny talked about it, and then last week we looked at it just a little bit, but I have more information today, and so that's very useful, because last week Johnny asked the question, how long we're in the garden. So here's some more information to consider about how long they probably were in the garden before they sinned and before they were kicked out of the garden. And we already talked about last week that part of the consideration when you're thinking about that is God had given them command to be fruitful and multiply, but they don't seem to have had any children yet. And so if, the first sin was not a refusal to multiply. I mean, that would have been sin because God had given them command. And we don't think about there was more than one way they could have sinned in the garden. The fruit was not the only way. They could have said in rebellion, we refuse to multiply, and they would have sinned, and I assume God would have kicked them out of the garden for that as well. But, or there would have been some kind of consequence anyway. But the first sin is not that they did not multiply, it's that they ate the fruit. And so we have to assume then that not very much time had gone by because they either didn't have the opportunity or not enough opportunity in order to get pregnant. And so you're looking at probably a short time. But here are some other things to consider on top of that. First of all, Genesis chapter 5 and verse 5 tells us that Adam was 930 years old when he died. And so, you're looking at some people they try to combine evolution and Genesis together to create sort of an evolutionary creation story. And so they say, well, Adam and Eve could have been in the garden for millions or even billions of years while such things were happening. And, for a very long time before they were kicked out because they could live forever, right? But we know that Adam only lived 930 years. So right from the start, we know that he had to have been in the garden less than that time because he lived some time, long enough for his children to get pretty old outside of the garden. But that, I want to say, Seth, it says, lived to be 800 years old. And so, you're looking at, he was 130 years old when Seth was born. Well, he was already out of the garden when Seth was born. So really, you're already looking at less than 130 years. But it seems likely that Cain and Abel were also born outside of the garden. And so you're looking at quite a bit less than 130 years that they were in the garden. We also consider what Jesus said in Luke chapter 11 and verses 50 and 51. Notice Luke chapter 11. It's a really fun passage because Jesus says a lot of fascinating things in a very short amount of time. But in Luke chapter 11, verses 50 and 51, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and the lawyers, and they, of course, are having some difficulties as they were wont to do. And he's pronouncing woes on them, woe to you, because they put burdens on people, and they honor the prophets as if they follow them, but they don't listen to them, and all of these things. And he says in verse 49, therefore the wisdom of God also said, I will send them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill and persecute. And so this is the context. He's talking about the apostles and prophets who died, specifically were murdered. And so verse 50, it says that the blood of all the prophets, which was shed from the foundation of the world, may be required of this generation. And so he is saying that right from the very start, very close to the beginning of creation, somebody's blood was shed, someone righteous, by somebody unrighteous. And then in verse 51, he clarifies, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the temple. Yet I say to you, it should be required of this generation. And so he says Abel was murdered very close to the beginning. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean on the day that on day 8 or anything, but the foundation of the world basically means, you're in the earliest time possible. Abel was murdered. And so they were created, they sinned, they came out of the garden, they gave birth to 2 sons. Those sons grew, we don't know how old Abel was when he died, I don't think. And but he grew old enough to be responsible for his own sacrifices. And he brings the sacrifice and his brother kills him. And so, that's hypothetically really a few decades. It didn't necessarily have to be very long before Abel was killed outside of the garden, which means it's even less time that they were in the garden. Also, in John chapter 8 and verse 44, Jesus is talking about the same people, the Pharisees, those lucky people. He always has such nice things to say about them. And they, of course, are ignoring the evidence of God. That's kind of the context. He's talking about how they're ignoring all the evidence that God is giving them that Jesus is the Messiah. And so he implies that Abraham is not their spiritual father, and that God certainly isn't their father. And so he says in verse 42, John 8:42, if God were their father, you would love me, for I proceed forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word. You are of your father the devil. And so here he says it just really plainly. And the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning. Now, there's a couple ways you can look at that. And part of it is we know that Adam and Eve sort of died, spiritually speaking, when they sinned in the garden. And so he could be referencing that concept, that he murdered them in a sense. But we also know that sin and temptation, ultimately, he is a source of those things at times, and that he has some kind of influence. And so when God tells Cain that sin is crouching at the door and it's ready to pounce on him, and he can rule over it, but if he doesn't, it will rule over him. You get the idea of the influence of Satan in some way. That is, Cain is responsible for his own actions. He didn't have to do it, but he is influenced. And that's why this murder is, in a sense, attributed to Satan. He was a murderer from the beginning. And so you get, again, the foundation of the world. All the way from the beginning, there's murder happening right close to the dawn of humanity that Jesus is talking about. And so it seems like in Jesus' mind, the murder was very shortly after the creation of the world, which means they couldn't have been in the garden very long. And so when you take the fact that we know how long they lived, and so it had to have been, probably less than 100 years easily. You take the fact that they were commanded to have children, and remember, they didn't have the difficulties of getting pregnant like we did because there was no curse yet. And so, the curse comes after she sins. There's no curse in the garden. And so we assume that their human bodies worked perfectly in every possible way. And so, as far as like trying, you could say like, well, people tried for a long time, and some of us know from experience trying for a long time to get pregnant. Adam could have tried for a long time and just didn't have success. It doesn't really seem logical when you think about why would they have difficulty when they have perfect bodies and in a perfect environment and no sin, no disease, no sickness, no problems to impede that ability, and that God has given them just the command to do it. And so everything is perfect and he's commanded them. Providence is not going to like impede their ability to have children logically. And so they don't have any trouble getting pregnant. Then they must not be in the garden long enough to really at least get all the way to birth. Who's to say if she was pregnant when she sinned? You can't really say that for certain. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. But it doesn't seem as though she had any children. And so it was probably a very short time. I don't know how long it was, but you think it doesn't take a couple long to get pregnant if they're very healthy and they have no difficulties to speak of, then you're looking at possibly even less than a year. Although I wouldn't, don't quote me on that, but you're looking at a very short time. I think is kind of what you're saying. Any comments or thoughts on that?
Well, in the garden, how do you, God is an eternal God. How do you number His years?
Sure.
And that's what He created them for in the garden. And I understand the logic behind the children and the population and everything. I do understand it, but I don't know. And if you've got an eternity to live somewhere, and He's gave you a command like that, how long does it take you to perform what He's asked you to do?
Sure. Yeah.
That's another term of logic.
Yeah. The only thing that I would sort of add to that is when you're talking about the context of Genesis, the emphasis often is on immediate obedience, and you see that at least twice with Abraham. He's told to circumcise himself and his whole household, including his 13-year-old son, and it says he did it that day. And the same thing, he's told to take Isaac up onto the mountain to sacrifice him, and so he gets up the next morning and does it. And so I think what you're saying is true, that there is space for, maybe he told them to multiply, but there was also space for them to sort of, get to know their environment and one another before anything like that.
God dealt with man is totally different after the garden.
And that's true too.
There's the conclusion is
Mm-hmm.
that you've got a situation before and after that we can't really.
Yeah, we can't say with any definitiveness some things about the garden because we're not told everything. I think that's very true, but in keeping it in context, when you're looking at Genesis as a whole, we are told what we're told about Adam and Eve for a reason, and they are a part of the whole story of the book of Genesis. And so, although it was different there, their purpose in Genesis is in connection with everyone who follows in Genesis, and that is a common thought in Genesis is that immediate. I'm not saying it means they have to have obeyed immediately. I'm just saying that I feel like what the evidence points to.
There's no aging in the garden. And he lived 930. It's really strange. You study those years. And Adam lived way into, a lot of people that we lived at.
Yeah.
He was there, still alive.
For pretty deep. Not Noah, but pretty deep.
Noah.
Almost, yeah.
And I thought, boy, that's really crazy.
It is crazy. And it's important to remember that in Genesis 5, they're not counting, obviously from Adam's birth, nor from how old he looked or how his body aged. They're just counting how many years he lived.
After he got out of the garden, I think that's when his days were not. That's what I think.
I can see how you can make an argument for that. Yeah.
He was the same man when God created him, but when he sinned,
right.
He left. I think that's
yeah.
the process started.
I could see that, other than that God from Genesis 1 is counting time. You know, day 1, day 2, and so it seems to me that God is counting time from the start because he has a need for time. And so it's not that paradise or Eden was like a nebulous, timeless zone. He has created time from the beginning, and because there's a purpose for time. And so that's the only reason why I would think that they probably counted it from the time that he was created. But I think you have a case. I think you could make an argument that they didn't start counting it until after the garden. I think that's fair. So interesting thoughts. Lots of things we can't say for certain about the Garden of Eden, but that would be my suggestions as to how to answer that question. You know, just based off of what I've thought and read and so forth and so on. So, any other thoughts about that?
The only thing is we know for sure is the devil didn't waste no time.
He did not waste any time. Yeah, I think that's true.
And so it would be to assume that they were not in the garden even a year.
I think you could say it's possible. Yeah, I think you could say it's possible for sure. And that is his way. You know, he wants success. He wants to triumph over God, and that's his sole purpose. You know, it seems that's what he lives for. And so, you know, if you live for something, you're not gonna, you know, obviously he's cunning. He'll wait for the right moment, but he's always working to achieve it. It seems, which is the idea of a prowling lion or something like that. That's why Jesus says he was a liar from the beginning. It seems that this was his intention from the start, and you see it in Genesis 3 that this is what he does. And that's another kind of interesting thought that I just want to spend a moment on is the Bible talking about the snake in Genesis 3, and what reason do we have that this is the way Satan is described? Because, you know, I mean, we know, based on what the rest of the Bible tells us, that Satan is a spiritual being. You know, that he's not flesh and blood like we are. He's like the angels or something like that. You know, he's more spiritual in nature, and so he's not literally a snake.
This without it says.
Yes.
So the Lord said to the serpent.
The serpent, yes.
To come down, and it says.
It also tells us that the serpent was the most cunning of the created beings.
Because
Yes.
you have done this, you are cursed more than all the cattle
Yes.
and every beast of the field, and on your belly you shall go, and
Yes.
you shall eat dust all the days of your life. So when it mentions serpent up here, you wasn't on his belly.
No, it doesn't seem that he was in some way. It's a difficult thing, but yeah, that does seem to be the case. And so the question is, you know, the New Testament, you would not even know this was Satan if you didn't have the New Testament necessarily. I think you could probably put it together, but Genesis doesn't tell us that. And you know, Genesis doesn't mention Satan again, or the serpent is not mentioned again in the book of Genesis. Moses writes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He writes all the first five books of the Bible. He does not mention Satan or this serpent. He mentions other serpents, but not this one again. And so for the first 5 books of the Bible, the only thing we're told about him is in Genesis 3. And if it weren't for the fact that Jesus said in John 8 that he was a liar from the beginning, that's really the most direct kind of evidence that this is Satan in the first place. Now there's other clues, but John 8:44 is really, and that's, you think, the book of John was written almost last. It was written about 90 AD. One of the very last books of the Bible ever written is the first one to really, that I can think of, directly point to the garden and say, that was Satan right there. And so I think they knew, you know, they were able to put the clues together. But that's the most obvious evidence. And so why then, if this is talking about the spiritual being, why does the book of Genesis describe it in this way? Why not just say, well, there was a spiritual being who, you know, tempted Adam and Eve, and, you know, what's the reason that Moses puts it within the serpent kind of story that he gives us here?
Because he wants him to go as low as he can go and crawl on his belly.
And I think there's some degree of, there's a parallel of comparing the snake to in reverse, yeah, to Satan. Sort of he exalts himself, and, you know, all who exalt themselves are humbled, and so that ultimate humble position that he's in. So there is that kind of parallel there. I think it also has to do with, as I mentioned, the historical context of the people who were living at that time. Moses is writing to the Israelites as they wander through the wilderness. And remember, what did they keep saying they wanted to do when things would get hard? Go back. Right? They want to go back to Egypt. Remember the watermelons and the cucumbers and all of the delicious things that we had to eat there? Remember how great life was when they were beating us day and night because we were slaves having to build brick? You always remember the past better than it actually was, right? And that's, they're wanting to go back. And the thing about Egypt was, as we said, they had a lot of different gods. And it's very curious, Egyptians didn't see snakes as necessarily evil or good. They were sort of neutral. And so, the Pharaoh wore a cobra head on his hat because it was a symbol of authority for him. And it was tied to a particular snake god that they worshiped. And I have written here, which we won't go through them all, at least a dozen snake gods that they worship, or gods associated with snakes in some way. But the ones that are the most interesting to me for the purpose of what Moses is doing is the serpent god Apophis. And the only reason I mention this is the Israelites knew of these gods because they were in Egypt for a long time, and they were the slaves building the temples and the different things for these. I mean, they knew these stories in and out. And you see evidence of that. For example, when Aaron builds the golden calf, that's not just any random, they didn't just pick a random animal. That represents an Egyptian god that they were already familiar with and that they were sort of going back to. And Joshua says at the end of the book of Joshua, to put away your idols. They've conquered the land and they still have their idols with them. And who were those idols? Well, they were probably any number of gods, but they also would have had Egyptian gods because that's what they were used to. For hundreds of years they were there in Egypt. And so they would have known of the serpent Apophis. I don't know if that's how you say it, but that's what we'll call it. Apophis. He represents, I think this is interesting, the darkness and the non-existence that was supposed to be before the creation of the world. Well, he's writing in Genesis 3, and in Genesis 1, we're told that before, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and there was darkness, and the Spirit hovered over the water, And so this snake in the Egyptian mind represents that darkness that Moses is correcting. He's saying it wasn't a snake. Right? That's silly. That's what Moses is saying, essentially. That's not what it was. Here's what it really was in Genesis 1. And this snake was said to, this is the one I was talking about in the sermon this morning, the one who would try to eat the sun god every morning. And so he kind of represents that chaos. But most of the snakes that they worship, they actually saw as good. In fact, they saw them as mothers. Most of the snakes they worship, they actually saw as some kind of mother figure who would protect and guard them and keep them safe. And in particular, there was one other one that I wanted to mention. And essentially, this snake was, let's see here, my notes are not quite as organized as I want them to be. Let's see here. It's so quiet. No. Okay. Okay, here it is. There's one in particular. There is a god whose name is Atum. Atum. Now, I went and tried to look at the Egyptian and the Hebrew to see if there really any similarity between the word Atum and the Hebrew word for Adam. And it seems like there may be some, but you can't say with any certainty. But it's interesting, all right? This is just interesting. So the Egyptians believed, the oldest Egyptians believed, there was the very first god was named Atum, and that he created himself out of nothing. The Big Bang is really not so new a theory after all. He created himself out of nothing, and that then he had some children who had children named Earth and Sky. And Atum, this creator god, he is the one who slays Apophis, right? So you have someone named Atum who's supposed to be slaying a giant snake who tries to end all of life. And these are Egyptian myths about creation. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds oddly familiar in some ways to what Genesis 3 is about. And then, as we said, there's another one, and its name is Amen Kamutet. That sounds Egyptian, right? So if you watch Egyptian, those mummy movies, that's probably how they would have said it. I'm sure that's right. So, and in other time periods, this was believed to be the first, they call it primeval god, who took the form of a snake to fertilize the first egg that created life. And so you have all these different theories and all these different thoughts that they had about the gods and how life came to being. And the idea is, what it looks like is there are some similarities to the Bible because at one point they, like all people, came from Noah. They knew the truth. And as time went on, they perverted the truth because they got away from God and righteousness. But you still see the evidence of their original knowledge of the truth in their stories that they've added weird things to and weird gods. Well, the Israelites are there in Egypt with them, listening to all these stories and clearly believing some of them. And so Moses writes this account. And he says that just like some of these gods who take the form of snakes, who choose to become, that Amen commented, he took the form of a snake to create life. Well, Moses says, here is, and combining it with Jesus' words, a spiritual being who takes the form of a snake to try to destroy all of life. This is what is true. He is not the creator God, like they think that he is. He is not the mother of all people, like they sometimes describe these snake gods. He's not even the darkness before that tries to eat the sun every morning. He's just a filthy old snake who wants to kill us. And that's what he is. And so Moses kind of sets the record straight, but he's using language that they would have been very familiar with. He's using imagery that they would have been very comfortable with. And so it'd be kind of like if Moses were writing us today, and if he used the language of the Big Bang, but corrected it to be accurate in order to help us understand creation. And the Bible does that over and over again. It uses the language of the time period, but redefines the words to be accurate, so that the people, he starts with what they know, and then he corrects it and brings them to an accurate knowledge of the truth. Now, I think he's still a snake. I think that what Genesis 3 says is true. There was literally a snake in the garden, or close to the garden at least, and that this snake tempted Eve, just like it says. I think all of it is true, and I think that's where the Egyptian myths come from, is because at one point they knew the truth, and then they changed it and twisted it over time, and now Moses is recorrecting it back to what was originally true. And so some of you are shaking your head, and I think I'm getting through. Some of you are tilting like this, and I think I'm not quite making sense to you. And so, but yes, ma'am.
I was just thinking image-wise.
Yes.
Thinking of Satan. Where supposedly he was a fallen angel.
Okay. And that is not what this class is going to be about today. It's a really good question, a really good thought. And I think it'd be a great thing to study sometime, but today we're not going to dive into the particulars. We can talk afterwards, yes. But as far as what does the Bible say about angels and how all that works, but regardless of why he is the way that he is, we do know that the Bible tells us that he's not human, he's spiritual, and that his goal is to deceive and to tempt and to lead as many astray as possible, and that he does that by influencing nations to lead God into sin. And that's in the book of 1 Chronicles. It talks about when David took the census. It says Satan stood up against Israel or Judah. And so David did the sin. He took the census. But it says Satan stood up against them. The idea that he influenced them in whatever way Satan does that, which is not what this class is about. We just take it for granted that that's what the Bible says in this moment. We can just explore that more later. But in this moment, we take for granted that the Bible just says he does influence the nations, and that's how he leads people away from God. And that's what he does to Adam and Eve. He influences them. He can't force them to sin. He can't make them sin. He can't do anything beyond just speak false things that for Eve's sake deceived her. She allowed herself to be deceived. And we're told later Adam was not deceived. He just did it anyway, because he was influenced by the serpent and then Eve to follow through with that. And so that's all that he can do. And you think about it, Moses is writing to a group of people who are indoctrinated with all of this Egyptian theology. They're just indoctrinated. And clearly to some degree they've held on to it because they want to go back. They keep saying, I want to go back. It's better there than it is here. Why did we follow this God? This God's going to let us die in the wilderness. They don't trust God. And so he is writing to a group of people who are very familiar with all of this snake imagery. And I don't know how much Moses knew about Satan, but let's just say Moses knew more than we did. He knew everything about Satan. Maybe just God told him the whole story. Let's just pretend for a moment that that's true. And he has two options. He can either use imagery that they're already used to, using an animal that's not necessarily good or bad in their mind, and so therefore is something that can be conquered. Or he can say, well, there's this guy that you can't see out there who tricks you or tries to trick you into sinning. And that's like the boogeyman, right? That's terrifying. They can see God. He's the pillar of fire and cloud. They can see him right there in front of him, and they don't trust him. They can see the miracles and the plagues and all the things he does, and they still struggle to trust him. Or there's this guy that you can't see, who sneaks around and influences you to sin. Well, they already don't trust the one they can see. How are you going to overcome the fear of the one you can't see, right? That's terrifying. Or you can use the images that they were already familiar with from Egypt, correcting them to be accurate, and describing something that they can understand and then let go of. Okay, they were deceived by a snake. That was terrible. Moving on. Because like we said, Moses never mentions the snake or Satan again. And so he uses the one that they can handle at the time. Now, as the Bible goes on, we're told more and more about Satan, because as our faith matures and as we know more in general, we can understand more about him and overcome that. But they were weak. This is all they could handle. They were. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah. Just to confound things some more.
I like it. Yes.
If he was, God made him to crawl on the ground.
Yes.
So what was he before? Not the serpent.
That's what he wouldn't let me go into.
I'm just trying to.
No, that we can
I'm
talk
trying
about.
to confound this a little bit more. Adam and Eve walked through the garden with whom? Who?
With God.
With God.
Yes.
Serpent didn't look like what we think of as a snake.
Right.
Did he walk with them also? That's just a question.
Yes, and that's a really interesting connection that I'm glad you picked up on. Go ahead.
And? Well, yeah, he talked with them, and he had some kind of repertoire with them.
Yes.
They didn't say, "Oh my goodness, who are you?" And
Right.
and along the lines, also, just another thought that what you're talking about. They were in there when they got the children of Israel. When they got bit by a snake, where did they go?
To the snake.
To the snake.
Yes.
So it wasn't always bad.
That's because of their Egyptian influence. They're not always bad. Yeah. So.
The name of the serpent.
Something or another.
Nakash or something like that.
Yeah.
My understanding, the Hebrews would have considered that to be the hissing, nasty sound.
Okay. I'm not familiar. I don't remember. So. That's probably accurate. Yeah. And so they.
So he was giving them a really nasty name.
Yes, and they still ended up worshiping him in the end at some point. Hezekiah had to destroy it. But no, I think what you're saying is really very interesting when you think about the comparison. So when you think of Eden, what you really are seeing is Genesis 1 creates this picture of God creating the universe, and in particular for their culture, it was him creating a universe-wide temple that he sat down on a throne in. And that's, in chapter 7, he sits down in his temple to rule the universe. And we're told, Isaiah says that, the heavens are his temple, and that the earth is his footstool. That of all the places in the world, or in the universe that he could have gone, he puts his feet here with us, because this is the center theologically or spiritually of the universe. And Eden then is the kind of like holy of holies, if you will, because all temples have that in common back then. A holy of holies, and then the outer one, the holy place, and then beyond. Well, Eden is the holy of holies, and Adam and Eve were, the high priest in essence that were in that holy of holies. And so the indication that you get is that he would come. It says during the cool of the day, he would come and he would walk with Adam and Eve. And remember, this is really our very first reference to the idea of walking, because that's what the Israelites did every day for 40 years. That's all they could do. They just walked. And so Moses is